Okay, so this is the first Art in the Contemporary World podcast, a series of conversations that we're going to have that refer to some of the current art that's happening in Dublin, Ireland and elsewhere, but also to some of the wider issues that might arise in relation to that, or some of the other interests that we might bring to that. What we're going to do in this first one is talk partly about the Futures exhibition currently on at the RHA in Dublin, but then we're also going to look at some other highlights from 2013, not in a way that is any kind of definitive roundup, but which maybe points to some partisan enthusiasms. The first discussion that we're having today involves me, Declan Long, and my colleague, the co-director of the MA Art in the Contemporary World, Francis Halsall, along with critic Rebecca O Dwyer and curator Vaari Claffey. So the first thing, as I say, that we're going to talk about is the Futures exhibition, Futures 13 at the RHA. This is an exhibition which, as they state, endeavours to document and contextualise the work of a selection of artists around whom exists a growing critical and curatorial consensus. And that's something, that statement, that we might actually consider the meaning of as we continue. The artists featured in Futures 13 are Jenny Brady, Neil Carroll, Anita Delaney, Emma Donaldson, Eleanor Duffin, Tracy Hanna and Maggie Madden. We might talk about many of these artists. We're not necessarily going to cover all of them equally. And the first thing to do then is perhaps come to you, Rebecca. What might be the first thought you would have about Futures 13 at the RHA?
I suppose the first thing I noticed about it was just the gender, I suppose, the gendering of it. There's only one guy here, but I think that's kind of that's good in that it reflects the sort of graduates that are coming out, and that there is that sort of I think a lot of group exhibitions tend to be male dominated, so I think it's an interesting mix. It's kind of quite diverse. You've got Jenny Brady and Maggie Madden. Well, you've got Jenny Brady, and then you've got Anita Delaney, who kind of have occupied these big kind of amphitheatre spaces, and then you've got Neil Carroll, who's working much more kind of traditionally, but in an expanded kind of sense of painting, kind of opening it up and fracturing it into kind of an installation. Then Eleanor Duffin, who's much more kind of material based, or I think philosophically engaged. There's kind of a probing of materiality. But I suppose the highlight for me, I think, was Eleanor's work. I just thought I hadn't really seen her work a lot before. It's kind of been on the same sort of radar, or I've encountered it kind of, or read about it quite a lot, but it was interesting to see it. I'm not sure about the installation of a lot of the show.
It's a very hard place to show work in, in a sort of basketball arena gallery.
I think some people came off a lot better than others. In particular, I think maybe Tracy Hanna wasn't the most fortunate. Because
and just for clarity on that, Tracy Hanna's show, part of the show was an installation within a structure within the space, film within the space.
I just thought it probably needed a bit more space. I think it was quite an immersive sort of piece, and it would have benefited from its own space, like the other two rooms, which were quite cavernous and kind of overwhelming.
Problematic soundly, from Anita Delaney's that kind of just disturbed the rest of the show. But it really, when you're looking at another video work and there's sound leak from work that sometimes runs into it and sometimes doesn't, it really made a problem for Tracy Hanna's work, because it had a tendency. It was a really interesting piece if you could forget about that going on in the background, because it's just really very purely visual, and because there's no narrative to it and it's so sculptured, it could slide into a kind of music video thing, which it really absolutely isn't. But I think that, having to kind of rethink it all the time because of the leak from the other work, it's really made a difficulty for me. It was really unfortunate.
Vaari, there were those are, I suppose, curatorial questions in some ways, and Rebecca's already raised some about how the work appears. Within that selection, then were there particular artists that you thought stood out?
Yeah, it was interesting. I think it's a really tough proposition how you pull a group of artists together, and is it that is it that it's at this moment that these ideas of critical and curatorial, even the idea of consensus is quite a difficult one. Why you would pick people that there's a kind of agreed idea around at a particular time, because like even the year before this, when they had Jim Ricks and Lucy Andrews in the same show, that's a really difficult idea to try to think about those two very different.
You might
artists.
also think, around him a growing and critical disagreement is emerging.
Exactly. They're
most visible, I suppose, isn't it? For
and so is the work going to fight with one another, and should it be allowed to kind of fight it out in the ring with other work, or how do you manage this idea about placing these works alongside one another, and how do you talk about that, or do you select these works to talk about a very particular thing in one year, or is it that it's just this slice through what's happening, this kind of gathering and pulling together? And if it's a kind of gathering and pulling together, then certain things will come out of it in the way that certain things came out of this, where there's a lot of work that deals with kind of ideas around anxiety, with detail, with kind of performed anxiety. So you have you've got Maggie Madden's work that kind of looks like, on first glance it looks like Mark Manders, at first glance it also looks like Alana Egan's, but then there's another kind of attempt at a real tender anxiety with that work. It's very brittle, it's very, very fragile, you feel like you could pass it by and it would fall over, and just holding on to that, I think, within a space where there's a lot of other work, was quite an achievement on her part. It's keeping that kind of really delicate balance. I wished for a little bit more awkwardness in some of the other works. Because it's a young person show, I wished for that awkward energy that Anita Delaney had, this kind of what the hell is going on. You have to kind of force yourself to sit down and watch those works 3 or 4 times, and she does, there are all these references that are kind of coming at you, like Jans Frankmeyer, and so I had to kind of calm myself down a bit to look at those works, because there's this kind of clamour of a lot of work that doesn't really sit very well together. This
could be quite a good thing, that in a way that we might have to calm ourselves down, or that the work might demand a new kind of patience. And with this, there was one negative review of the piece published recently, which sort of had a go at the idea that this was a new, highly academic form of art. Have you any thought in relation to that? A sense that that maybe the work is somewhat problematic because it's dealing, say, for instance, with philosophical references, or it's immersing itself in advanced science, or whatever else.
There did seem to be a shared, if there was a shared anxiety, also perhaps a shared engagement with a re-engagement with the art object as a focus for sort of theorising, perhaps, or are we thinking about the rematerialisation of the art object kind of through this? And that does come with a set of philosophical ideas that are also being kind of performed elsewhere, new philosophical engagement with objects and so forth. So I wonder whether that was shared between them. Yes, perhaps that also makes the work difficult, but this is something that I thought was interesting about it. I don't think difficulty is necessarily a bad thing.
I think it's probably, in a way, the work is to be commended exactly on that level. Difficulty doesn't necessarily mean elitist or obscure. It can often mean a new kind of challenge. The very fact that artists like this would be wrestling with new ways of thinking, new ways of relating materials to thought at a time when the material world and the immaterial world are converging or diverging in all kinds of exciting, challenging, threatening, scary ways.
If you take Neil Carroll's work, for example, this is clearly about materiality and about interrogating materiality, about, of course it's an old idea, but taking painting and expanding it through not only the medium, but through the materiality of that medium. That seems to be a very, very kind of an interesting thing. That he would be concerning himself less with image making or with representation and representation, but with actually wrestling with the solidity and three-dimensionality of the work. And he's making big sort of walk-in installations that don't function like installation, they're functioning more as sort of somewhere between architecture and surface.
But we get this with Anita Delaney too as well, don't we? The way in which things sort of smash against or are ripped or hit each other. This sense of contact and of breakdown and haptic relations. This seems to be
the editing, I suppose, as well.
Quite specific. I mean, there was a lot of breakdown. In Maggie Madden's work, there was a lot of picture frames. There were picture frames of dust in M. Donaldson's work. A lot of it's the stuff, the kind of detritus of art making.
Yeah.
That it's painting a lot of these things, absolutely breaking down into becoming rubbish and then becoming reconstructed in some way.
Yeah, I love the picture frame piece there on the second one on the wall. I thought it was fantastic.
The
Maggie Madden's piece, yeah.
Because it really kind of draws you along those walls and kind of draws you into what might have been there before and might have come down from those spaces.
There can be a danger, can't they? Let's say with artworks that, kind of to draw on your reference, Francis, about the new philosophies of materials and objects and so on that might be being touched on or alluded to in some instances here. That there's a danger perhaps that when artists draw on this kind of material, it becomes very literal, or there's a kind of flattening that everything, all objects and all relations between objects are somehow interesting. Is that a fair criticism?
Yes and no. I mean, I think in part that often what we find is that curators and critics have been drawing upon these theories, and we're talking in this instance about the theories associated with speculative realism, object-orientated ontology, and so on, in the context of this being named as an influential philosophy in the art review list of the year. Okay, so and sometimes it doesn't easily fit, but then you've got artists who make stuff which is what they've always done. And sometimes theories get bolted onto it, and sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. So I wonder whether there is sometimes a theoretical overdetermination of the use of these theories. But it's not necessarily coming on the part of the artist. Often it's coming on the ways in which this work is being contextualized.
I suppose it's interesting, the title, though, isn't it? Futures as well.
Yeah.
Sorry. I was talking to someone who thought that they were going to be in Futures next year. So that there is this kind of, anticipation of what next year is going to be like, that it is kind of based on speculation. So I think it's talking about a kind of rematerialization of the art object is well and good, but it's kind of denialist or something as well when you have that people are already being posited for next year, and it's reputational, I suppose, as well. It's this sort of who's most visible at that time, but also anticipating who's going to be visible next year.
Yeah. Okay, so it's a good point to conclude that part of our discussion on. The other things that we were going to do then in our discussion here were to move towards some things which are maybe highlights from 2013, or maybe things that are worth thinking about coming out this year more broadly. And there's a number of things that we thought were worth discussing. And again, these aren't necessarily the most important things of the year. They aren't necessarily the very best things of the year, as we all agree consensually, as the RHA might propose. But rather a number of things that we think captured our attention and maybe merit other people's attention. So again, maybe Rebecca, without meaning to seem like I'm picking on you, could we start with you, because I think the thing that you've selected has a connection to what we've just been talking about.
Yeah, I suppose over the course of the year there's been, I think, 5 events that have been organised by DUST, or the Dublin Unit for Speculative Thought. Kind of came from nowhere, I suppose, and then there was, it didn't come from nowhere, but the group was kind of formed, I suppose, the end of 2012, and then there was just this whole plethora of events starting in March with the conference Weaponising Speculation. And over the course of the year there's been, I think, 4 or 5 events, and a lot of philosophers talking, and also kind of promoting a kind of an evaluation of how artists think about philosophy and what's their relationship to it. And even though you might kind of disregard some of the ideas, or you might agree with it, whatever, it's certainly opening up a space for debate and reflection for where artists and kind of critics or writers or whatever can think about the relationship to philosophy and think why it has such a kind of esteemed relationship, I suppose.
Can you recall particular bits, say, from Weaponising Speculation or any of the other events that, good papers or interesting presentations?
Alice Recap was really fantastic, I thought.
And that was at Weaponising Speculation?
That was at Weaponising Speculation. I missed the Stephen Shaviro talk. That was supposed to be quite good, was it?
Yeah, he's an interesting character. Yeah. Somebody who moves between a variety of different disciplines, including film studies, literary studies, philosophy, and so on. And exists often at the fringes or the edges of some of these disciplines, whilst still being an academic.
Yeah.
One of the things that characterises dusts is, as they self-style themselves, they are sort of quasi-academic or para-academic in some respects. They also sort of exist in the spaces between institutional disciplines and have, in a positive way, a sort of parasitic relationship to institutions. We've been delighted to host them here, but they're in somewhat of an antagonistic relationship to us. We don't want to own what it is that they do. And some of the philosophy they're dealing with is a bit left field. Frankly, it wouldn't be accepted in philosophy departments. And so that's an interesting thing to happen.
And as with all, I guess, areas of philosophy or scholarship, presumably there's quite a lot of disagreement within the Dust group, which we should probably say is the Dublin unit for speculative thought. Is that right? You know, the different thinkers and scholars and writers within that group don't all necessarily hold a shared position. Would that be accurate?
Yes, I think they've come from different places, from sort of quote-unquote hardcore philosophy in some cases, from elements concerning queer theory, from ecology, but also debates that are going on in the art world and so on. And that makes it kind of exciting, not least because often it fails. But that's kind of good and exciting with these sort of failed conversations, or these conversations that lead to dead ends and so on, can happen. And it's exciting to see a sort of an energy around ideas and a place where artists and other theorists are talking to one another.
And Rebecca, do you sense that they're sometimes misunderstanding each other in terms of artists and philosophers?
I think it's a kind of a fraught relationship, right? I think a lot of the philosophers would be kind of weary of artists kind of hijacking their theories or misinterpreting, but also there's a misunderstanding on behalf of the philosophers as well, and how artists view their work, or so I think they're just coming at it from two different places. But it's been interesting, I suppose, to see over the course of the year in terms of Dust that it's kind of been this arc, of kind of hype, and then towards the last event there with Robert Jackson, there was certainly a sense of disillusionment, which was mutual. So it'll be interesting to see what happens next year, I suppose.
And this sort of thing, Vaari, does it stay on the fringes, or do you think, Francis already mentioned that, say, for instance, Mesu and Harman and these thinkers have made it into the Art Power 100. Do you think, as a curator, you draw on this stuff, or are people broadly drawn on it in ways that are credible?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, credible is a kind of difficult one to think through, but I do think that, I think that they're becoming more central of these kinds of thinking, and the kind of how active that has to be. I mean, when Francis, you were talking about artists have always made stuff, and now the conversation seems to have drawn very close between those kinds of thinkers and art makers, and I think that can only be productive. And I guess it's managed more or less well in various different situations. But I do think that pulling those things into the kind of very centre of things can only, and it'll move in and out. Inevitably, these things will move in and out. But I think it has been and will be key in terms of productivity in the next few years.
There seems to have been certainly some exciting presentations by artists. You mentioned Alice Recap and Sam Keogh, for instance. Did a very acclaimed performance presentation at one of these. So I guess there's new challenges for artists in these circumstances to put yourself there in front of a group of people who are often terrifyingly brainy. Maybe just terrifying sometimes, But that predicament for the artist is a daunting one, perhaps, but also a daunting one for the philosophers to be able to take things on which don't exist within the paradigms of presentation and articulation and abuse.
I think its potential and its excitement rests on whether people do start to agree. Because if there is agreement and if there is consensus, it will die. That will be the end of it. Because there needs to be productive and creative antagonisms within that, or else it will just become too cozy and it will be used as a kind of a justifying armature for stuff. And I hope that continues to happen. I hope more antagonisms emerge out of this rather than a kind of an easy, bland consensus.
Yeah, I mean, I think that they're fascinating to engage with philosophers. I noticed yesterday I put something up on Facebook, a little thing Zizek had written, and an awful lot of the kind of art people respond by liking or approving in general, and the philosophers respond going, "This man is an idiot. He has no brain." Clearly Zizek is a very, very intelligent man, but to other philosophers, he's he's an absolute idiot. So it's that they do have the wonderful capacity that sometimes in the art world we don't have to kind of openly engage in intellectual warfare, which is certainly enjoyable
to watch,
to watch, if not to be a victim of. But okay, so I think the Dust events we can definitely record as being something which was a highlight of 2013. That's something which was an ongoing project and something which will continue into next year. Vaari, you've mentioned something which is also a little ongoing, but perhaps a little smaller scale.
Yeah, I mean, just in terms of, I didn't see, for various reasons, very much outside of Ireland this year. So one of the things we may talk into is the things that I'm looking forward to, and a lot of the two kind of big things that happened this year that sort of open out is the reopening of IMA. Kind of looking forward to the programme for next year, but it's just it felt surprisingly good to be back down in that museum and to see it in use again, and to see people pouring through the museum. I actually really enjoyed Arthur Terrace as a venue, and I think it has real possibilities, and I think it'd be a shame if it doesn't get used, because that large scale video space is a real loss now that it's not over here. But I also really enjoyed the opening out of the programme, a project with Celine Condoretti's show that's on now, Additionals, and the way that's been programmed with Cian, the director, whose primary interest is theatre, and Tessa Giblin, both thinking their way in and out of an exhibition and bringing in a theatre company to kind of act upon a show that's there. And it is difficult, and it's not, what happens with it is not always public, and it's kind of hard to engage with. And I've been able to be very close to it because I teach out of there on Fridays. So, but I do think, watch this space. I think there's really a lot more to come out of that kind of thinking. And I'm also really interested to see what Chris Nelson does in the Fringe Theatre and how his engagement with visual art pans out.
It's one of these things that raises the question of a certain kind of difficulty again, doesn't it? That our expectations about visiting a gallery might be frustrated in this context, because we need to perhaps come back again or follow something over time, or consider the gestures that are taking place, not something which are really about some kind of immediate stimulation, but something which demands our thought.
It's like a space for kind of activation,
Were there other project exhibitions this year? Just because you were mentioning project.
Well, I just actually want to talk about Sam Keogh's exhibition at Curlin.
We of course showed previously a project, but maybe we can jump to a different gallery.
Jumping over to a different gallery. I thought that exhibition together with Josephine Galli's working in the line of beauty and Emma were two kind of very strong points for me, because I've been looking at those two artists' work for a really long time, and I think that the Curlin took quite a big risk with Sam's show there, with the way that exhibition's installed and the way it kind of took over the entire space. But I think that Sam, to a certain extent, is a forerunner in a particular kind of exhibition making, in a particular way of thinking across, as we were saying, across thinking about philosophy, thinking about presenting, thinking about making situations in which work gets made, thinking about working collaboratively against other artists' thinking, and also kind of community building around that, and how you speak about that at the point of exhibition making. I think it's quite interesting, and I think both himself and Joe, although they work very closely together, they deal with that in very, very different ways, and how Joe Noonan-Ganley manages the viewer in that space. That he's got a whole series of text panels that are,
this is in the Line of Beauty,
in the Line of Beauty exhibition, that are quite difficult, and they demand an awful lot of time. But at the same time, he's absolutely refusing to take them down from the wall and to take them into another situation that's not that exhibition. Situation. So there is this moment of turning the viewer into a kind of performer and making a certain demand of the viewer that both Sam and Joe have been thinking into for a while. So I really look forward to how that is going to manifest in future, and how their thinking around those things is going to expand. Because I think that to me, that's kind of the most exciting and the most demanding thing that younger artists could be doing.
Rebecca, you also saw, and I think you've written about Sam's exhibition at the Curling Gallery. And what were your responses to it?
I think it's a very ambitious show. You know, I like the energy of it, I suppose, but it's kind of trying to embody this kind of contradictory or something, but in a good way, I suppose. Like this kind of using Oscar, you know, and kind of bringing him in as this kind of
Oscar the Grouch.
Oscar the Grouch from Sesame Street, and trying to kind of bring him in as this kind of not kind of dystopian, I suppose, figure, and kind of putting forward a different way of living or something. But I suppose by bringing him into that system and kind of presenting him, not glamorizing, but well, to a certain extent, I suppose glamorizing it. But it's kind of once he has to be kind of flattened or compromised to be brought into his kind of worldview or chaos. So I suppose it's that kind of double bind of bringing this figure in, but then at the same time kind of neutralizing him.
But one of the interesting ambiguities about Sam's use of Oscar the Grouch is that that's how Sesame Street has also sort of used the figure of Oscar the Grouch.
Yeah.
And plays with that very, very nicely.
Yeah.
That here is the figure of the outsider or the other, but that it becomes absorbed within the world, the cozy world of Sesame Street. As Sam says, his homelessness becomes his choice, rather than actually the kind of the conditions of neoliberal capitalism that have produced. So his sort of alterity becomes, in some respects, sanitized, and that makes the conditions of the social situation palatable and acceptable because it makes them available for representation.
Is there a danger that presenting stuff in this sort of clean white space of the gallery has that effect, or is Sam very knowing in that regard?
I think it's knowing, all right. Yeah, absolutely.
That it's part of the same process being undertaken. Yeah. There was, of course, another presentation of related work which happened at the Frieze Art Fair. Very similar work, and in this case, rather than just laying across the gallery floor, Sam's linoleum of swirls and patterns and psychedelic colours, this elaboration on Oscar the Grouch, kind of went up the walls as well, and it was even more immersive in some ways. And in that context of the Frieze Art Fair, had a really unusual effect within this kind of hyper commercial environment. A very powerful one, actually.
I'm not sure if it was this year, but Mick Wilson's text on the bins. That I don't know if any of you saw that.
It was in the lab.
It was in the lab, and it certainly went online this year. Where he talks about the role of rubbish in his life, and how and it's something that Seamus Nolan spoke about. That every time when we flush the toilet, we're instantly a part of a wider community, and this idea of how we manage our waste, and how we manage, and kind of Mick Wilson's ended up kind of valorising waste by freezing putting large sections of his rubbish into the freezer so that it won't smell in the bins, and kind of collecting it and making these kind of massive sculptural installations in his own kitchen out of the leftover of his social life. And I think that there's this there is this kind of ambition to considering everything, to giving everything this kind of attention, and that's what Oscar does. There's a kind of an ambition to that that could be productive and interesting.
I was going to say something in terms of a looking back at 2013 about Derry and about the City of Culture year of Derry, but maybe I'll just say that was a highlight, and that the combination of the Turner Prize show and the Willie Doherty show and the various other shows and the great work of CCA Derry, London Derry, and a Void in Derry, that there was a real heightened energy that was very, very exciting. But I probably said a lot about that during the course of the year, and maybe one thing to say about that, when you mentioned about the venue in Imma, it would been great to see maybe Earlsfort Terrace continue to have a role as a visual art space. It would certainly be a great situation to see the Ebrington site where the Turner Prize was situated in Derry to continue to have a similar kind of cultural use as a visual art space. So I'll mention that, but maybe we could also move towards looking forward. Unless Francis, did you want to say something about 2013? Grand summarising statement about everything that was important in 2013.
Important to me or important to society?
They're the same thing, aren't they?
I was sort of taken aback and surprised at myself for finding Tino Sehgal and Emma so engaging, because that's not to my taste, that sort of thing. But actually, in some respects, his work and my engagement with his work touches on several of the theoretical issues we've already mentioned. The way in which, in this space, theory was being performed, but it was being performed for sort of aesthetic effect. I found myself being in there for an hour, having a very rich and engaging aesthetic experience as I saw people performing theory, but I genuinely didn't learn an extra thing. This wasn't a sort of a rich pedagogical or theoretical experience, but it was a sort of absolutely intriguing aesthetic experience. So it does raise an interesting issue that we've already talked about in relation to dust, with regards to the relationship between theory and practice. There seems to be theory as aesthetic performance. And it also, to a certain extent, or I think not in the ways in which it's often talked about, did also position, as Vaari said, the viewer as performer, although in maybe not quite the way in which it's often sort of spoken about.
Yes, there's certain declarations about Tino Sehgal's work which are often different from the declarations from the part of the artist that are sometimes different from the effect of the work as its experience.
Yes, it seems to me that I've said this point several times before, but that actually one way of thinking about Tino Sehgal is as a contemporary form of impressionism. That he's taking the certain moments of our contemporary moment, certain conditions of our contemporaneity, and putting them back in the gallery space for aesthetic reflection. His work is absolutely not about collaboration or about immersion in those sort of ordinary senses. So I was very, very kind of surprised, because it took quite a bit of courage for me to step over the threshold into the space. It's not something I would normally do, but then found myself, against my better judgment, perhaps, finding that very, very interesting.
So Francis, any other highlights from 2013?
Yes, and they were all performances. They were all ephemeral events. The first was Charles Hayward playing in the Joinery, the musician previously involved with the band This Heat, and did a wonderful performance on drums and piano to a small audience. But I'm delighted to see that the Joinery are able to host such events. They've sort of reset their program and are really, really focusing on what they do very, very well, what they're best at, which is live performative events, particularly around music. And they're one of the few places in Dublin where you can see experimental music and so on. So that was a real highlight.
The music is always astounding. Really.
It really is. I've seen so many fantastic bands in the Joinery space, and this was a particular highlight from many this year.
And there was something else. There was a couple other things.
There were two others. Another one was a musical performance. Martin Creed playing just him and his guitar in Broadstone a couple of weeks ago, which was absolutely astonishing. As warm, as generous, as open-hearted, as quirky and as funny as his art. I was delighted. And it was exactly the right length. It wasn't too long. It could have grated if it had gone on for a bit longer, but that's absolutely wonderful. And then the third was a sort of a one-off event that happened almost by accident, when we had the opportunity through the MFA programme and Art in the Contemporary World to invite Stuart Lee, the comedian Stuart Lee, in to talk to our MA group. And he's a particular hero of mine, and I had the opportunity to interview him in front of the class, and that was, again, fantastic. Another warm, generous, very intelligent man who had much to say about comedy, about education, all of which, we never talked about art once, but all of which was absolutely relevant to art.
Well, one of the things I remember him saying was about, a time of, alternative comedy, or kind of all kinds of, strange writing and experimentation within the BBC, and how there was, a period when this sort of thing was valued for its own sake, and that more broadly, thinking about art and culture and so on, there was a sense of the society felt that, that art, was itself valuable.
Yes, exactly.
It didn't have to prove its value. Financially, maybe we should be proving its value, but not necessarily in financial terms. And he said interesting things about that.
Very, very interesting things. And I hope that the students left his inspiring talk, more angry than they were when they went in, because it seem very, very angry about some of the conditions of education and art making today.
So, Francis, you're really looking forward to the products of anger.
I certainly am.
Yeah, looks forward in anger. Okay, well, maybe we'll quickly wrap up with another little moment of looking forward. Rebecca, is there anything in particular? Not a problem if there isn't, that you're looking forward to in 2013. And we're ready.
Finishing my PhD.
Finishing your PhD. That's definitely something to look forward to. Vaari?
Yeah, I'm looking forward to catching up on all that. I mean, I've seen very little, but I've heard remotely about a lot. I'm looking forward to catching up and seeing the Philippe Perrino and the Pierre Week shows in Paris. And it's interesting. I don't really remember a time when so many solo shows have been talked about in the way that those shows have been. As absolutely unmissable events in the calendar, and I think that's been happening slightly more this year. The Joel Tourlinks, Luke Spacker,
Steve McQueen,
has really, really very important solo shows. A lot of times people talk about your shows to travel to.
Yeah.
People travelling to a solo show doesn't happen as often as you might wish. I think that's really, that's really exciting. Look forward to that.
I think it's kind of meaningful actually at the moment, and there's things as well like the Isaac Enskin and MoMA and very, very big kind of moments of capturing these artists' work at a very high level. And
I don't want to think too hard about what it means for curating. But,
no, but it might mean a lot of good things.
Yeah,
as well,
exactly.
A different kind of focus and attention and so on. But
like I said, I'm looking forward to seeing what happens at Project. I very much enjoyed the Douglas High Gallery program this year. I know you were going to mention
Francis
Pritchard. But also there are some really interesting, exciting shows coming up at IMA. We were just talking about that program. Isabel Nolan, Helio Ajasika, Harry Nusra. It's a really, really exciting.
Yeah, and it should be the year, I suppose, when director Sarah Glennie begins to kind of actually make her presence felt as a director. So it'll be very interesting for us to see how that goes, because the program looks very exciting. Yeah,
and the ambition to open the museum out and have it used in a very different way is potentially really interesting. Let's see what happens.
Francis?
I'm going to echo what Vaari said, particularly on the Imma show and the Oasis Seeker in particular, but also from a perspective of working at NCAD, there is a really interesting moment of engaging with a kind of research set of research activities around the program as well. We've collaborated with Imma this year on an MA class around the course, which seems to have been very productive, and that there'll be opportunities for that in the future, particularly given that some of those shows really are sort of theoretically and historically rich. The Utasika one in particular.
Well, it does make a lot of sense in a way that galleries would, museums, would, build research into their programming in a way that happens elsewhere. So, okay, I think that's probably quite a lot to be thinking about. And maybe that will do as the first Art and Contemporary World podcast. So thanks very much, everybody.